What would it take for you to torture another human being? You might think, never. You might believe with absolute certainty that you could never harm someone else deliberately. But history and psychology suggest otherwise. Picture this. A man in a white lab coat tells you to push a button. Each time you press it, another person screams in pain. You hesitate, but the authority figure insists, keep going. It's part of the experiment. Would you stop or would you obey? Now imagine this. You're a college student. You volunteer for a study. You're assigned the role of prison guard. At first it feels like a game, but soon you start shouting at the prisoners. You humiliate them. You strip away their dignity. Within days, you find yourself acting in ways you never thought possible. You didn't plan to be cruel, but something inside you shifted. When we think of evil, we often imagine monsters, villains from movies, cold-blooded killers, people born broken. But the truth is more unsettling. The people who commit atrocities are often not so different from you and me. They are neighbors, friends, parents, teachers. They laugh, they love, they live ordinary lives. And yet, under the right conditions, they can transform into something terrifying. That is the real horror. That is the truth we don't want to face. Evil is not always about who we are. It is about what we can become. Today, we are diving into the psychology of evil, how ordinary people turn into perpetrators, and why the line between good and evil is much thinner than you might think. But psychologists see it differently. They rarely use the word evil. Instead, they talk about harmful behavior, dehumanization, moral disengagement. They study not just the extremes, but the ordinary decisions that lead to cruelty. Think about it. Evil isn't always a sudden, shocking act. It's often a series of small steps, a joke at someone's expense that strips away their humanity, an order followed without question, a silence kept when you know you should speak. Each step feels minor, even harmless, but together they can build into something devastating. So what really makes a person evil? Are some people simply born that way? Or does it depend on circumstance, pressure, and the choices we make in moments of weakness? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people who commit terrible acts don't think of themselves as villains. They justify what they're doing. They believe they're serving a greater cause. They convince themselves the victim isn't fully human, or that someone else would have done the same thing anyway. And that raises the chilling question. If evil isn't about being born bad, but about transformation, what forces in the world around us have the power to change ordinary people into perpetrators? Some of the most chilling insights into human behavior don't come from history books, but from psychology labs. Experiments designed not to harm, but to understand. And what they revealed still shocks us today. Let's start with one of the most infamous, the Milgram obedience study. It was the 1960s. Volunteers came into a lab, thinking they were part of a study on memory and learning. They were told to administer electric shocks to another participant every time he gave a wrong answer. The shocks began mildly, but with each mistake, the voltage increased. Soon, the man in the other room screamed in pain. He begged for it to stop. He went silent. And yet, most participants continued to press the button, simply because a man in a white lab coat calmly told them, "The experiment requires you to continue." 2/3 of people obeyed to the point of delivering what they believed was a fatal shock. These were not sadists. They were ordinary people. And under the right conditions, they became capable of inflicting extreme suffering. Now consider the Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, volunteers were divided into two groups, prisoners and guards. The guards were given uniforms, sunglasses, and batons. The prisoners were stripped of their names, reduced to numbers, and locked in cells. What happened shocked even the researchers. Within just a few days, guards began abusing the prisoners. They shouted insults, deprived them of sleep, forced them into humiliating tasks. Prisoners broke down emotionally, some sobbing uncontrollably. The study had to be cut short after only 6 days. It was supposed to last 2 weeks. Again, these weren't hardened criminals. They were college students, volunteers, but given power and a role to play, they slipped into cruelty with alarming speed. What do these experiments tell us? that the potential for evil doesn't live only in dictators, killers, or villains. It lives in ordinary people. And it can be unleashed by authority, by roles, by the environment itself. The seeds of evil are not rare. They are everywhere, waiting for the right conditions to grow. So how does this transformation actually happen? How do ordinary people cross the line from hesitation to harm, from kindness to cruelty? Psychologists have identified several powerful mechanisms, invisible forces that can quietly turn normal individuals into perpetrators. The first is dehumanization. When you stop seeing someone as fully human, it becomes easier to mistreat them. It starts with language, calling people animals, parasites, vermin. Once a group is stripped of its humanity, cruelty feels justified. History is full of examples: Nazi propaganda, comparing Jews to rats, or genocides fueled by slogans that reduce people to cockroaches. Dehumanization doesn't just make violence possible, it makes it feel righteous. The second is obedience to authority. We're wired to respect rules and leaders, but this instinct can be twisted. When someone in power commands us to act, we often obey, even against our conscience. The Milgram experiment showed this with shocking clarity. People will cause harm, not because they want to, but because they're told to. Third is group conformity. Human beings crave belonging. We look to the group for cues on how to behave. If everyone is silent, we stay silent. If everyone joins in cruelty, we feel pressure to do the same. Nobody wants to be the outsider, the weak link, the traitor. And so we conform, even when our gut tells us it's wrong. The fourth is diffusion of responsibility. When many people share the blame, no one feels accountable. It wasn't me, it was the system. I was just following orders. It wasn't my decision. This spreading of responsibility allows people to commit terrible acts without ever feeling personally guilty. And finally, moral disengagement. This is the psychological trick of justifying harm. Telling yourself the victim deserved it, that the suffering isn't real, that it's all for a greater good. With each justification, cruelty feels less like cruelty and more like duty. Together, these mechanisms form a dangerous cocktail. Dehumanization strips away empathy. Obedience silences doubt. Conformity pressures us to join in. Diffusion of responsibility hides our guilt, and moral disengagement allows us to sleep at night. This is how normal people change, not in one sudden leap into darkness, but in a series of small, almost invisible steps. Steps that can turn neighbors into enemies, co-workers into accomplices, and ordinary citizens into monsters. Evil isn't locked away in history books. It's not just about what happened in Nazi Germany, in Rwanda, or in the prisons of the past. The same psychological forces that drove those horrors are still alive today, in quieter but no less dangerous forms. Think about the internet. Behind a screen, dehumanization happens instantly. People aren't people anymore. They're usernames, avatars, faceless strangers. It becomes easier to hurl insults, spread hate, or join in a digital mob. A few cruel comments snowball into harassment campaigns. Lives are destroyed not with guns or prisons, but with words, rumors, and relentless pressure. Or consider radicalization. Ordinary people, neighbors, co-workers, even family, can be drawn into extremist groups. It rarely starts with violence. It begins with belonging, with finding a group that offers identity, purpose, and certainty. And once inside, the mechanisms we've already seen take over. Us versus them. Obedience to authority, conformity to the group. Bit by bit, a person who once seemed ordinary can come to justify, even celebrate, violence. And then there's the workplace. We might not think of evil in the context of offices or corporations, but corruption, cover-ups, and exploitation often thrive under the same psychological patterns. Employees stay silent because everyone else is doing it. Managers obey orders from higher up, even when they know it's wrong. Responsibility is diffused across departments and hierarchies until no one feels personally accountable. The result can be devastating, whether it's financial fraud, environmental disasters, or lives lost because of negligence. The truth is unsettling. The line between good and evil isn't drawn only in moments of war or genocide. It exists in everyday life. in the way we treat strangers online, in the decisions we make at work, in the silence we choose when we see harm happening around us. If the psychology of evil shows us how people fall, then the other side of the story is just as important, how people resist. Because while many give in to authority, to conformity, to cruelty, some don't. Some stand up even when it costs them everything. History remembers these people as heroes of conscience. The soldier who refuses to fire on civilians, the citizen who hides families from persecution, the whistleblower who exposes corruption despite threats and isolation. They are proof that even in the darkest situations, resistance is possible. So what makes them different? Psychologists point to a few powerful traits and strategies. The first is awareness. When you understand the mechanisms, dehumanization, obedience, conformity, you can recognize them in action. Awareness creates a moment of pause, a chance to choose differently. The second is questioning authority. Blind obedience is dangerous, but asking why can disrupt the chain. It doesn't always take defiance on a grand scale. Sometimes a single refusal is enough to inspire others to do the same. Third is empathy. When we actively remind ourselves of the humanity of others, when we picture their families, their fears, their pain, dehumanization loses its power. Empathy makes cruelty harder, resistance easier. Fourth is the courage to speak up, even when it's unpopular. Silence protects the system. Voicing dissent, however small, can break the illusion that everyone agrees. It can create cracks in conformity, cracks that others can step through. And finally, moral courage. The willingness to act not because it's safe or easy, but because it's right. This doesn't mean being fearless. Most who resist feel fear, but they act anyway. And that choice, repeated by enough people, is what prevents harm from spreading unchecked. Resisting evil doesn't happen by accident. It happens through awareness, empathy, and courage. It happens when individuals choose to be human in the face of inhumanity. And it raises the question, when you are tested, when the pressure mounts, when the choice is laid before you, will you obey or will you resist? If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe. And if you want curious questions answered, have a look at some of our other videos.